I have often observed that London has a way of swallowing men without leaving any trace of their passage. It was upon a cold evening in November that I returned to Baker Street, my coat damp with fog, and my thoughts heavy with the day's duties. The city outside had been wrapped in that familiar grey haze which blurs gaslight into soft halos, and turns every passing figure into something uncertain and ghost-like. Sherlock Holmes was already in the sitting-room. He sat in his armchair with his legs drawn slightly forward, his eyes fixed upon the fire. A violin lay untouched upon the table beside him. From his stillness one would have thought him idle, but I knew better. That quietness was never emptiness. It was concentration of the most intense kind. For several minutes he did not speak, nor did I disturb him. I had learned long ago that Holmes's silences often carried more meaning than his words. At last, without turning his head, he said, "You are late, Watson." "The weather delayed me," I replied, removing my coat. "No," said he calmly, "not the weather. You stopped at the surgery longer than usual. A patient with a lung complaint left side, moderate severity, but worsening." I stared at him. "You were not there." "No," he answered, "but your sleeve carries the faint scent of iodoform, and your watch chain has a smear of chalk used in pulmonary examination. Only one sort of case produces both together at this hour." I smiled despite myself. "You are in excellent form tonight." "I am in observation," he said quietly. At that moment footsteps sounded on the stairs. Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door. "There is a gentleman below who insists on seeing Mr. Holmes at once," she said. Before she could add more, Holmes spoke. "Show him in." A moment later the visitor entered. He was a man of about 50, neatly dressed but travel-worn. His coat was damp, not from rain alone, but from long exposure to fog. His face carried a tension that suggested sleeplessness rather than illness, though his eyes betrayed something deeper, unease, or perhaps fear. He paused just inside the room, as though uncertain whether he had entered the correct place. Holmes studied him without moving. "You have come from the coast," Holmes said. The man started slightly. "Yes." "Harwich," Holmes continued. "Not by direct train, but by an overnight connection. You have not eaten properly since yesterday evening, and you are not here for yourself." The man swallowed. "No." Holmes gestured to the chair opposite him. "Sit down." The visitor obeyed at once, almost relieved to surrender control of the situation. For a moment he said nothing. Then, in a low voice, he spoke. "My name is Edward Mallory. I am a clerk in the service of the Admiralty." Holmes inclined his head slightly, but did not interrupt. "I was sent," Mallory continued, "to verify the identity of a man who arrived 3 days ago at the port office in Harwich." I noticed Holmes's expression change very slightly at that phrase, "verify identity." Mallory continued. "The man claimed to be Captain Henry Vance." At this, Holmes's fingers tightened faintly together. "Claimed?" Holmes repeated. "Yes," said Mallory. "But the problem is, Captain Vance is already dead." A silence fell in the room. Even the street outside seemed to quieten. I glanced at Holmes. His eyes had sharpened, but his voice remained calm. "Explain." His eyes had sharpened, but his voice remained calm. "Explain," he said simply. Mallory hesitated, then leaned forward. "Captain Vance was declared dead 6 weeks ago. His ship was lost in a storm off the Dutch coast. There were no survivors. The Admiralty closed the file." "And yet?" Holmes prompted. "And yet," Mallory said, lowering his voice, "a man arrived in Harwich claiming to be him. He carried Vance's identification papers. He knew details of the voyage that only the captain could have known." He stopped. "But?" Holmes repeated. Mallory's hands trembled slightly. "But his appearance was wrong." "Slightly. Enough to disturb anyone who had known him personally. He looked like Vance." I felt a faint unease settle in my chest. Holmes remained silent for a few moments, then asked, "Where is this man now?" Mallory swallowed. "That is the problem, Mr. Holmes. He disappeared last night." Holmes leaned back slightly in his chair. "From a locked room?" Mallory looked surprised. "How did you?" Holmes raised a hand gently. "Continue." Mallory nodded. "He was placed under observation at a naval office. A guard was stationed outside his room. No window large enough to escape through. No second door. Yet by morning the room was empty." A long silence followed. Outside a carriage passed through the fog, its wheels faint against the wet streets. Holmes finally spoke. "And what, precisely, did you come to me for?" Mallory hesitated before answering. "Because," he said slowly, "the man who disappeared was already listed as dead." Holmes did not move, but I saw it then, that faint narrowing of his eyes which always signaled interest at its highest level. He rose slowly from his chair and walked to the window. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, almost to himself, he murmured, "A dead man who leaves no body, and a living man who carries the dead man's identity." He turned slightly toward me. "Watson," he said quietly, "we may be dealing with a very interesting inversion." I frowned. "Inversion of what?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Of death itself," and outside, in the thickening fog of London, a bell from some distant clock struck midnight far earlier than I expected it to, as though time itself had begun to behave incorrectly. The morning after Mallory's visit brought no clarity, only a deeper, more unsettling sense that London itself had begun to conceal its intentions. The fog had not lifted. If anything, it had thickened, pressing against the windows of Baker Street like a living presence. Even the gas lamps outside seemed subdued, their glow weakened, as though the city had chosen to dim itself for reasons unknown. Holmes had been awake since dawn. When I entered the sitting-room, I found him standing by the fireplace, fully dressed, his coat already on and his hat resting upon the table. That alone told me the matter had moved beyond theory. "You are going out early," I observed. "I am going to Harwich," he replied. "So soon?" He turned slightly toward me. "A man who disappears from a locked room is either a trickster or a message." "And you believe this is a message?" "I believe," said Holmes quietly, "that we are meant to see something in Harwich that was not seen by those who first observed it." There was no further discussion. When Holmes moved with such certainty, argument was merely delay. Within the hour we were aboard a train moving eastward through a grey and muffled landscape. Holmes sat opposite me, silent for most of the journey, his eyes fixed not upon the passing fields, but upon something internal, some pattern forming in his mind. At last I asked, "What do you make of the dead man who is not dead?" Holmes did not look up. "I make nothing of it yet. That is the difficulty." "Then what are you searching for?" He paused before answering. "Consistency." The word puzzled me. "Consistency in what sense?" "In death," he said simply. I must have shown my confusion, for he added, "Death is usually final. It leaves residue, records, a body, a grave, a certainty. But here we have contradiction. A man declared dead, yet behaving as though alive. Another man alive, yet treated as though already removed from the world." He leaned slightly forward. "One of these states is false, possibly both." By the time we reached Harwich, the sea air had begun to press into the town with a cold, metallic sharpness. The docks were active, but there was a tension in the atmosphere that I could not immediately explain. Men worked, but more quietly than usual. Conversation stopped when we passed. Even the gulls seemed distant. Mallory was waiting for us at the station. His face looked more drawn than before. "You came quickly," he said. Holmes stepped forward. "That depends on what we are approaching." Mallory hesitated. "The naval office is this way." We followed him through narrow streets toward a modest stone building near the harbor. It bore no distinguishing marks beyond its official purpose. Yet as we approached, I noticed something peculiar. The guards outside were positioned not as if guarding against intrusion, but as if guarding against observation. Holmes noticed it too. "You have increased security," he said. Mallory nodded. "Since the disappearance." "From whom?" Holmes asked. Mallory did not answer immediately. When we entered the building, I was struck by its simplicity. A small administrative office, a corridor, and at the end of it one locked room. The door was already open when we arrived. Holmes stepped inside first. The room was small, furnished with only a chair, a desk, and a narrow bed. It was exactly the sort of place designed to prevent escape. The window was sealed with iron bars far too narrow for passage. The doorframe showed no signs of force, and yet it was empty. Holmes stood still for a long moment, observing everything without speaking. I watched him closely. There was something different in his manner now, not surprise, not confusion, but a tightening focus, as though the contradiction had finally begun to take shape. He knelt beside the bed and examined the floor carefully. "Interesting," he murmured. "What is?" I asked. He pointed to the dust near the bed frame. "No disturbance here." He rose and moved to the desk. "And no indication of struggle." Mallory spoke nervously from the doorway. "There was no sound during the night. The guards swore it remained locked." Holmes nodded absently, still studying the room. Then he said quietly, "He did not leave this room." Mallory frowned. "But he is gone." Holmes turned toward him. A pause. "And that is precisely the problem." I stepped forward. "Then where is he?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the window and examined the iron bars, then the stone frame, then the glass. Finally he spoke. "Watson, this room has not been used for escape." "Then for what?" Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "For observation." A silence followed. Mallory looked confused. "Observation of what?" Holmes turned slowly. "The guard," he said. The words did not immediately make sense to me. But Holmes continued. "If a man disappears from a locked room, we assume escape. But we forget to ask a simpler question." He paused. "What if he was never meant to remain here at all?" I felt a faint unease. "You think he was removed?" Holmes shook his head. "No. He was repositioned." Mallory blinked. "That is impossible." Holmes stepped closer to him. "Is it?" He gestured toward the room. No sign of struggle, no broken seal, no forced entry or exit. A pause, which means either he vanished. Holmes looked at him directly. "Or the room is not what we assume it to be." At that moment I felt a chill pass through me. Holmes moved to the far wall and tapped it lightly. Once, twice, a third time. The sound changed, not hollow exactly, but layered, as though the wall contained more than one depth. Holmes turned to me. "Do you hear it, Watson?" "Yes," I said quietly. He nodded. "There is space beyond this room." Mallory shook his head. "There is nothing beyond it except stone." Holmes smiled faintly. "That," he said, "is what you have been told." He placed his hand against the wall and pressed. For a moment nothing happened. Then, with a soft mechanical click, a section of the wall shifted inward by less than an inch. Mallory stepped back immediately. "What is that?" Holmes did not answer. He pressed again. This time a hidden panel disengaged fully. A narrow passage lay beyond, unlit, waiting. I felt my breath tighten. Holmes spoke softly. "He did not escape this room. He looked into the darkness. He was moved through it." And then, in a lower voice that carried no trace of doubt, "And someone is still using it." From within the passage came a faint sound, not footsteps, not movement of a man, but something more deliberate, like the turning of a mechanism that had been waiting a very long time to begin again. Holmes stepped forward and said quietly, "Now, Watson, we find out what kind of death walks without a body. There are discoveries which illuminate a mystery, and there are others which deepen it so profoundly that one begins to suspect the ground beneath one's feet is no longer reliable." The hidden panel in the Naval Office at Harwich belonged to the second category. Holmes stood before it without hesitation, as though the existence of concealed architecture beneath an official building was not only expected but inevitable. I, however, confessed to feeling a distinct unease as I looked into the narrow darkness beyond. It was not the darkness of an ordinary passage. It felt arranged. Mallory's voice broke the silence behind us. "This is impossible. That wall is part of the original construction." Holmes did not look back. Original construction is rarely final construction. He stepped forward into the passage. I followed him. There are moments in my life I can recall with absolute clarity, and this is one of them. The instant when the air changed. The moment we crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped slightly, but more noticeably the silence altered. It was no longer the silence of an empty space, but of a space that was actively suppressing sound. Mallory hesitated at the entrance. Holmes spoke without turning. "If you intend to understand what is happening, you will come further. If not, remain behind and continue believing in your locked room." That was enough to compel him forward. The passage was narrow, lined with old brickwork that showed signs of deliberate reinforcement. Not hastily constructed, but carefully maintained. The floor sloped gently downward. Holmes moved ahead with steady confidence, occasionally pausing to examine the walls with his fingers, as though reading a text written in stone and dust. After several yards he stopped. "Interesting," he murmured. I joined him. "What is it?" He pointed to the wall. "Tool marks." I examined them. "From construction?" "No," Holmes said quietly. "From adjustment." Mallory frowned. "Adjustment?" Holmes nodded. "This passage has been modified more than once." A chill ran through me. "For what purpose?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he continued forward. The passage widened slightly after a turn, revealing a low chamber illuminated faintly by a single gas lamp fixed to the wall. It burned with a steady, controlled flame, too steady for something meant to be unattended. Holmes stopped at once. "Do not touch it," he said. Mallory blinked. "It is just a lamp." Holmes shook his head slowly. "Numero. It is a marker." I studied it more carefully. The lamp was positioned at exact eye level, facing directly down the corridor we had entered. Holmes continued, "This is not lighting for convenience. It is positioning for observation." He moved closer, examining the floor beneath it. Then he said quietly, "Someone has stood here recently." Mallory looked uneasy. "The guard." Holmes interrupted. "No." He straightened. "This was not a guard's position. It is too precise, too deliberately aligned with the corridor entrance." A pause. "Someone stood here to watch who entered." We moved past the lamp into the chamber. Beyond it the passage branched into two directions. Holmes knelt briefly and examined the dust. Then he selected the left path without hesitation. "How do you know?" I asked. He replied simply, "Because it is used more often." We followed the left passage. As we advanced, I became increasingly aware of something unsettling. The passage was not merely underground infrastructure. It was structured like a system of observation lines, angles, junctions, and recesses positioned in such a way that a person could observe movement without being seen. After several minutes, Holmes stopped again. Ahead of us, faint light appeared. Not natural light, not gaslight, something colder, more controlled. Holmes raised a hand, signaling silence. We advanced carefully. The passage opened into a wider chamber, and there I saw something that made me instinctively stop. On the far wall was a series of wooden frames like viewing slats, each angled toward a central point in the room. Beneath them stood a chair, but not an ordinary chair. It was fixed, bolted into position. Holmes approached it slowly. "This," he said quietly, "is the observation seat." Mallory frowned. "Observation of what?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked up through one of the slats. I followed his gaze. Through the narrow viewing gap I could see something beyond. A second chamber, and within it, a bed, the same bed from the locked room. I felt my throat tighten. "That is impossible," I whispered. Holmes nodded once. "No," he said. "It is consistent." Mallory looked confused. "But the man, he was in the room." Then he vanished. Holmes turned toward him. "He did not vanish," he said calmly. "He was transferred." "Through what?" I asked. Holmes walked toward the wall and tapped it lightly. A hollow sound returned. Then another. He stepped back. "This structure is not linear," he said. "It is layered." A pause. "Multiple rooms occupying overlapping spatial positions." I frowned. "That is not possible in a standard building." Holmes smiled faintly. "Exactly." He turned toward the observation slats again. "And yet here it is." Mallory's voice shook slightly. "Then the man, the one we were guarding—" Holmes completed the thought. "He was never in a single room at all." Silence followed. Then Holmes continued. "He was being observed continuously from multiple positions. His location was adjusted without his awareness." I stared at him. "You are saying he was moved while remaining in the same building?" Holmes nodded. "Not moved physically." A pause. "Reframed." The word hung in the air. Mallory shook his head. "This is madness." Holmes turned sharply. "No," he said firmly. "This is engineering." He stepped into the center of the chamber. "This system allows a subject to appear confined while actually being repositioned between overlapping compartments." He looked at the chair, and someone was operating it. A silence followed. Then Holmes walked to the edge of the chamber and examined a set of faint markings on the floor. "Foot traffic pattern," he murmured. "What does it show?" I asked. Holmes replied without looking up. "It shows that the operator did not leave." I frowned. "Then where are they?" Holmes straightened slowly. "They are still here." At that exact moment a sound echoed behind us, a soft mechanical click, then another. Holmes turned immediately, but too late. A hidden panel in the chamber wall slid open silently, and a voice spoke from within the darkness. "You are correct, Mr. Holmes." We all froze. Holmes did not move. The voice continued calmly. "The subject was never meant to disappear." A pause. Continued calmly. "The subject was never meant to disappear." A pause. "He was meant to be relocated." Slowly Holmes spoke. "And the man?" A faint response came from the darkness. "There was never just one." A silence fell so complete that even breathing felt intrusive. Holmes stepped forward slightly. "Then show yourself." From the darkness a figure emerged, not hurried, not cautious, but entirely composed. And as the light from the chamber fell upon him, I realized something that made my blood run cold. I had seen him before. At Harwich, watching, always watching. The man who should not have been there. The man who had already been declared dead. And now, he was smiling. Holmes's voice remained steady. So, he said quietly, the stranger who was already dead was not a single individual. The man nodded. No. A pause. Only a position. And behind him, deeper within the passage system, something began to move again. Slowly. Systematically. As though the entire structure had just remembered it was still active. For a few seconds after the man stepped into the light, none of us moved. It is difficult to describe the sensation that followed, not fear in its ordinary form, but a kind of mental hesitation, as though the mind itself refused to accept what the eyes were reporting. Holmes, however, showed no such hesitation. He studied the man with the calm attention he might have given to a newly discovered principle in chemistry. The man stood quietly, hands loosely at his sides, as though he had not intruded upon a confrontation but arrived at a scheduled appointment. At last Holmes spoke. "You are not Edward Mallory's naval clerk." A faint smile touched the man's face. "No." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "And yet you arrived with his report." A pause. "And you were present at Harwich," Holmes continued. Holmes nodded once, as though confirming a calculation. "Then you are not a person in the conventional sense of identity. You are a function distributed across multiple roles." The man inclined his head slightly. "That is a rather elegant way of putting it." Behind me, Mallory made a low sound of protest. "This is absurd. I saw you. You spoke to me." The man turned his head slightly toward him. "You saw a required instance of me," he said calmly. Holmes did not look away. The man gestured faintly toward the chamber around us. "This system is not built upon secrecy alone. It is built upon substitution." A pause. "Wherever a single identity is expected, multiple temporary embodiments are deployed." Holmes replied quietly, "And the identity itself?" The man smiled again. "Is irrelevant." The words settled heavily in the air. Holmes stepped forward one pace. "You are suggesting that the stranger who was already dead is not a man at all, but a position within a structure." Holmes paused. "And the structure extends beyond Harwich?" The man nodded. "Much beyond." A silence followed. Then Holmes said, "Then this is not an isolated experiment." "No," the man replied. "It is a method." I felt a tightening in my chest. Holmes turned slightly toward me. "Watson," he said quietly, "we are dealing with distributed identity." I frowned. "Distributed?" Holmes nodded. "A single role occupied by multiple individuals at different times, in different places, under controlled conditions." The man added calmly, "or a single individual presenting multiple roles, depending on requirement." Holmes corrected him immediately. "More likely the former." The man did not object. Holmes continued. "Which means the dead man Mallory described," the man completed the thought, "was never one body." A silence followed. Holmes turned toward the observation chamber beyond. "And the disappearance from the locked room?" The man replied, "A transition." Holmes nodded slowly. "Between positions." "Yes." Holmes exhaled softly. "That explains the absence of forced entry, and the absence of exit, and the absence of struggle." The man smiled faintly. "Now you are approaching the correct frame of reference." Holmes turned back to him. "And the purpose of this system?" The man hesitated for the first time, then said quietly, "Observation under constraint." Holmes raised an eyebrow. The man gestured toward the structure. "A subject is placed within a controlled environment. Their perception of confinement is maintained. Their responses are recorded." I frowned. "You are experimenting on prisoners?" The man looked at me briefly. "Not prisoners." A pause. "Observers." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Meaning?" The man answered calmly. "Individuals who believe they are interpreting reality, when in fact they are part of its construction." A silence followed. Holmes spoke quietly. "And the man you transferred through this system?" The man replied, "Was not important individually." A pause. "He was a variable." Holmes stepped closer. "And what was being measured?" The man looked at him directly. The word landed like a stone in still water. Even Holmes did not respond immediately. Then he said softly, "Explain." The man nodded. "You were not brought here to solve a disappearance." A pause. "You were brought here to demonstrate how you solve it." Holmes remained still. The man continued. "Every step you took in Harwich, every inference, every conclusion, every correction, it was recorded." A faint mechanical sound echoed somewhere within the passage system. Holmes did not look away. "And the purpose of recording it?" The man replied, to model your reasoning process. A pause. So that it can be replicated. Silence followed. Holmes's expression did not change, but something in his eyes hardened slightly. You are attempting to construct a predictive model of deduction. Holmes nodded once. And I assume I am not the first subject. The man shook his head. No. Holmes turned slightly. And I will not be the last. A pause. No, the man agreed. Holmes studied him for a long moment, then said quietly, You have misunderstood something fundamental. The man tilted his head slightly. And what is that? Holmes replied evenly. Deduction is not a sequence. A pause. It is a living process. The man frowned slightly. Holmes continued. It adapts to resistance. It evolves under contradiction. It is not a pattern you can extract and reproduce. The man's expression remained calm. That is what we are testing. Holmes stepped back. Then you will fail. A faint silence followed. Then the man said softly, We already have results suggesting otherwise. Holmes did not respond. Instead, he turned toward the observation chamber again. The locked room, he said quietly. Yes, the man replied. Holmes gestured toward it. You did not merely relocate the subject. A pause. You staged perception across multiple observers. Holmes nodded slowly, and ensured that each observer saw a coherent but incomplete version of events. Holmes turned back to him. So no single witness holds the full truth. The man smiled faintly. Precisely. Holmes was silent for a long moment. Then he said quietly, That is where your model fails. The man frowned slightly. Holmes continued. You assume truth is the sum of observations. A pause. But truth is what remains when contradictions are reconciled. The chamber fell silent. Even the mechanical sounds within the passage seemed to pause. Holmes stepped forward once more. And I am now beginning to see your structure clearly. The man studied him carefully. Holmes continued. You are not studying me. A pause. You are attempting to replace me. A faint tension filled the chamber. The man did not deny it. Instead, he said softly, We are attempting to understand what happens when deduction becomes reproducible. Holmes replied immediately. It ceases to be deduction. A silence followed. Then Holmes added quietly, and becomes something else entirely. At that moment a deeper sound echoed through the passage system, not mechanical, not human, but systemic, as though multiple components had begun to synchronize. Holmes turned sharply toward it. The man said calmly, The observation cycle is expanding. Holmes looked at him. Expanding into what? The man smiled faintly. Into your city. A long silence followed. Then Holmes spoke quietly. Watson? Yes? Stay close. And for the first time since the case began, I understood that we were no longer inside a mystery. We were inside an operating system, and it had just begun to scale. There are moments in investigation when one expects escalation when the mind, having accepted a certain level of strangeness, prepares itself for something greater. And yet what occurred next at Harwich was not escalation in the ordinary sense. It was repetition, but repetition made impossible. The man standing before us calm, composed, speaking of positions and distributed identity had not moved, nor had Holmes, nor had I. Yet somewhere within the passage system behind us that faint mechanical harmony continued to build, as though the building itself had begun to breathe in structured intervals. Then came the sound, not distant, not approaching from afar, but already present just beyond the chamber threshold. Holmes turned instantly. So did I. Mallory stepped back instinctively, his face pale. The man in front of us did not react at all. The footsteps entered the chamber, and with them came a second figure. At first I thought my mind had misinterpreted the light. Then I thought I must be mistaken entirely. But the figure stepped fully into view, and I recognized him. Edward Mallory, the same man who had brought us from Baker Street, the same man standing beside me moments before. And yet also not, because the Mallory who entered now was disheveled in a different way. His coat was damp in a manner that suggested a different journey. His expression carried a different strain, and his eyes, most importantly, did not recognize himself standing only a few feet away. For a long moment neither version of Mallory spoke. The silence became unbearable. Then the first Mallory, the one who had accompanied us into the passage, whispered, That's... The second Mallory looked directly at him, and frowned. Who are you? He asked. The words struck the chamber like a physical blow. Holmes stepped forward immediately. Do not speak further, he said sharply. But it was already too late. The second Mallory's gaze shifted between us, then settled on The second Mallory's gaze shifted between us, then settled on Holmes. "You are Sherlock Holmes," he said. Holmes did not respond. The man who had spoken of positions smiled faintly. "Interesting," he murmured. Holmes turned slightly toward him. "This is not duplication," Holmes said quietly. The man replied, "No." A pause. "It is continuity." Holmes's eyes narrowed. The man gestured toward the second Mallory. This instance arrived from a parallel execution path. Holmes replied instantly, "A divergence." "Yes." Holmes turned back toward the two Mallorys. "So both believe themselves to be the original." The man nodded. "That is correct." A silence followed. Then Holmes spoke quietly. "Which one is real?" The man smiled faintly. "That is the wrong question." Holmes did not react. The man continued. "Both are real within their assigned context." A pause. "And neither is complete." The second Mallory stepped forward slightly. "I was sent to deliver a report," he said cautiously, "to Mr. Holmes." The first Mallory shook his head quickly. "No, I delivered the report." They both stopped. A strange tension formed between them, confusion layered upon confusion, each man attempting to assert the continuity of his own experience. Holmes raised a hand. "Enough!" Both fell silent instantly. Holmes turned toward the architect. "You are creating overlapping identity states," he said slowly. The man nodded. Holmes continued. "And introducing them into shared environments." "Yes." Holmes paused, and observing the conflict, a faint smile. Holmes exhaled slowly. "You are not studying deduction." The man inclined his head slightly. "No." A pause. "We are studying contradiction under pressure." Holmes looked at him sharply. "And what do you expect to gain from this?" The man answered calmly. "Predictability." Holmes did not speak for a moment. Then he said quietly, "That will not work." The man tilted his head. "And why not?" Holmes turned slightly toward the two Mallorys. "Because contradiction is not stable." A pause. "It resolves." The man's expression shifted slightly. Holmes continued. "And when it resolves, it selects truth." The man replied, "Or it eliminates it." A silence followed. Then the chamber lights flickered. Twice. And somewhere deep within the passage system, a synchronized mechanical sound began again, but this time more rapidly. Holmes looked upward. "This system is accelerating." The man nodded. "Yes." Holmes turned sharply. "Why?" The man replied, "Because resolution is approaching." A pause. Holmes narrowed his eyes. "What resolution?" The man studied him carefully. "Your intervention." A silence fell instantly. Even the two Mallorys stopped moving. Holmes spoke quietly. "So this entire structure, Harridge, the passage system, the identity duplication, was designed to converge on me?" The man nodded. Holmes replied, "Then you already know the outcome." The man smiled faintly. "That is what we are here to test." Holmes stepped forward. "And if I refuse to participate further?" The man's expression remained calm. "Then the system continues without you." A pause. Holmes asked quietly, "At what cost?" The man replied, "At reduced precision." Holmes exhaled slowly. "And that is unacceptable to you." A silence followed. Then Holmes turned toward me. "Watson." "Yes?" "If I ask you a question, answer precisely." I nodded. Holmes continued. "Which Mallory delivered the original report?" I looked at both men. They looked identical in structure, but not in detail. Slight variations in posture, in fatigue, in emotional residue. But I realized something more disturbing. Both believed they were correct, and both had memory continuity. I then stopped. Holmes spoke softly. "You cannot determine it." I shook my head. "No." Holmes turned back toward the architect. "That is your error." The man frowned slightly. Holmes continued. "You assume identity is a static object that can be replicated." A pause. "But identity is relational." He gestured toward the two Mallorys. "It depends on continuity of observation, not internal consistency alone." The man replied calmly, "And yet both instances maintain continuity." Holmes shook his head. "Individually, yes." A pause. "Collectively, no." A silence followed. Then Holmes stepped closer to the center of the chamber. "You have created parallel narratives," he said. "Yeah." "And forced them into collision." Holmes paused. "But you forgot something fundamental." The man studied him. "And what is that?" Holmes replied quietly, "The observer." A faint silence followed. Then Holmes continued. "I am not part of your system." A pause. "I am external to it." The man's expression tightened slightly. Holmes stepped forward again. "And I determine which narrative collapses." For the first time uncertainty flickered across the architect's face. The chamber lights flickered again, more intensely. The mechanical rhythm beneath us accelerated further, and both Mallorys stepped back instinctively. Holmes turned slightly toward me. "Watson," he said calmly, "you may wish to remember this moment precisely." I frowned. "Why?" Holmes's eyes remained fixed on the system. "Because," he said quietly, "this is where observation becomes action, and beneath us, the structure began to decide which version of reality would survive. The chamber at Harwich did not change in any visible way at first. There was no collapse of stone, no sudden violence of machinery, no dramatic fracture of structure such as one might expect when an engineered deception begins to fail. Instead, what occurred was far more unsettling. The system began to select. A faint vibration passed through the floor beneath us, subtle enough that it might have been mistaken for the settling of old stone, yet rhythmic in a manner that suggested intention rather than decay. Holmes stood perfectly still. His gaze was fixed not on the two Mallorys nor on the architect, but on the unseen structure beyond the chamber walls. I had learned by then that when Holmes ignored the obvious, it was because his attention had already moved to the governing principle behind it. The architect spoke first. "Stabilization is beginning." Holmes did not look at him. "No," he replied quietly. "Resolution is beginning." The man frowned slightly. "They are the same process." Holmes shook his head. "They are not." A pause. "Stabilization maintains a constructed state," Holmes said. "Resolution eliminates incompatible states entirely." The architect studied him for a moment. "And you believe you can influence which state remains?" Holmes finally turned toward him. "I do not believe it," he said calmly. "I know it." A silence followed that felt heavier than anything we had yet experienced in the passage system. Then something subtle happened. The first Mallory, the one who had traveled with us, took a step backward, not in fear, but in confusion. His gaze drifted toward the second Mallory, and then stopped, because the second Mallory was no longer standing exactly where he had been. He had shifted, not physically walked, not moved in the ordinary sense, but altered position relative to the chamber geometry, as though the room itself had adjusted his placement. I felt a tightening in my chest. "Holmes!" He did not respond. The architect, however, spoke. "Do you see it now?" Holmes answered without turning. A pause. "And it is inefficient." The architect raised an eyebrow. "Inefficient?" Holmes stepped forward slightly. "You are allowing identity overlap to persist too long." The architect replied, "We are observing the decay process." Holmes shook his head. "You are not observing decay." A pause. "You are generating it." The words seemed to unsettle the man for the first time. Holmes continued, "And now the system must decide what to preserve." A faint mechanical hum intensified beneath us. The floor vibrated again, this time more distinctly. Then the lights flickered, and for the briefest instant the chamber did something I can only describe as realigning. The walls seemed to shift by a fraction of perception. The observation slats altered their angles. Even the air felt rearranged. And when everything stabilized again, one of the Mallorys was gone, not vanished in motion, not seen leaving, simply absent as though he had never occupied the space at all. The remaining Mallory staggered slightly. "What happened?" he whispered. Holmes looked at him. "You have been selected." The man turned sharply. "Selected for what?" Holmes replied quietly, "Continuity." The architect exhaled slowly. "Interesting," he murmured. Holmes turned toward him. "This is your system's weakness." The man frowned. Holmes gestured toward the remaining Mallory. "You assume selection produces truth." A pause. "But it only produces stability." The architect said nothing. Holmes continued. "And stability is not the same as reality." The chamber vibrated again, more intensely now, a low mechanical rhythm building beneath the floor like a pulse becoming aware of itself. Holmes stepped closer to the architect. "How many iterations have you run?" he asked quietly. The man hesitated. Holmes narrowed his eyes. "Answer carefully." A pause. 17. Holmes nodded once. "And how many resulted in convergence?" The architect's expression tightened. Holmes replied immediately. "And those are the only ones you retained." A faint silence followed. The architect did not deny it. Holmes stepped back slightly. "Then your system does not learn from failure," he said. "It discards it." The architect answered calmly, "Failure introduces instability." Holmes replied, "So does truth." A pause. "And yet only one leads to understanding." The chamber lights dimmed briefly, then brightened again. The remaining Mallory looked between them, his expression hollow with incomprehension. "I don't understand what is happening any more," he said quietly. Holmes turned toward him. "That," he said gently, "is because you are no longer a fixed reference." The man's voice shook slightly. "What does that mean?" Holmes studied him for a moment. "It means your identity is being evaluated against competing continuities." A pause. "And only one will persist." The architect stepped forward. "Exactly." Holmes turned sharply. "And you believe I will allow that process to continue?" The architect met his gaze. "We believe you will complete it." A silence followed. Then Holmes said quietly, "You are mistaken." The chamber fell still. Even the mechanical rhythm beneath us seemed to hesitate. Holmes stepped forward into the center of the room. "I do not complete unstable systems," he said calmly. "I dismantle them." The architect's expression tightened. "You cannot dismantle what you do not fully map." Holmes replied immediately, "I already have." A pause. For the first time the architect showed something close to uncertainty. Holmes continued, "Your system is not based on identity." A pause. "It is based on observation delay." The architect did not respond. Holmes gestured upward slightly. "You prevent any observer from seeing a full sequence at once." A pause. "So they construct partial truths, and those partial truths generate controlled contradiction." The architect spoke quietly. Holmes nodded. "But you made one assumption." The man frowned. "And what is that?" Holmes looked directly at him. "That contradiction is stable." A pause. "It is not." Holmes turned slightly toward the remaining Mallory. "And now we will demonstrate why." The chamber vibrated again, more violently this time. The mechanical rhythm beneath us accelerated to a point where it no longer felt like sound, but like intention. Holmes stepped back. "Watson," he said quietly, "stay behind me." I obeyed immediately. The architect took a step backward. "You are attempting to collapse the system prematurely," he said. Holmes replied calmly, "I am allowing it to collapse naturally." A pause. "And then I will observe what remains." The chamber lights flickered one final time. And then everything changed, not explosively, not dramatically, but decisively, as though the system had reached the end of its tolerance for contradiction, and selected its final state. The remaining Mallory turned toward Holmes, and in that instant I realized with absolute clarity that the question was no longer who he was, but whether he would continue to be at all. What followed was not chaos in the ordinary sense. It was loss of agreement. The chamber at Harwich did not explode, nor did it fall silent. Instead, reality itself seemed to lose its ability to remain consistent from one second to the next. The remaining Mallory took a step toward Holmes, but the moment his foot touched the ground, the motion appeared to repeat slightly altered again and again, as though the act of walking had been split into several competing versions of itself. Holmes did not move. He simply watched. The architect stepped back, his expression now tightly controlled, though I could see for the first time that the certainty had begun to leave his posture. "The system is stabilizing incorrectly," he said. Holmes replied calmly, "It is resolving without your permission." A faint tremor passed through the floor. The lights dimmed, then brightened, then dimmed again in uneven intervals, as though the chamber had forgotten the rhythm it was supposed to follow. And then I saw it. The observation slats along the wall, those narrow viewing frames through which the earlier chamber had been seen, began to show different versions of the same space. Not reflections, not illusions, but conflicting arrangements of the same reality layered over one another. In one slat the Mallory stood facing Holmes. In another he was mid-step. In another he was already gone. I felt a sharp tightening in my chest. "Holmes!" He did not look away from the chamber. "Yes, Watson." "This place is—" Holmes answered softly. "It is correcting itself." The architect turned sharply toward him. "That is not possible." Holmes finally met his gaze. "Then your model is incomplete." A pause. "And for the first time—" "Then your model is incomplete." A pause. And for the first time the architect showed something close to alarm. The Mallory in the chamber spoke again. But his voice did not arrive as a single sound. It arrived as multiple overlapping versions of itself. "I don't understand. I don't understand. I don't—" each fragment slightly out of phase with the others. Holmes stepped forward one pace. "Stop speaking," he said quietly. The sound did not cease. Instead, it multiplied. Holmes narrowed his eyes. "Watson," he said calmly, "do not rely on a single interpretation of what you are seeing." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," Holmes replied, "that the system is no longer selecting one outcome at a time." A pause. "It is producing all outcomes simultaneously." The chamber shuddered again, and then something unprecedented occurred. The architect staggered. Not physically, but perceptually, his form briefly splitting into two overlapping positions before snapping back into a single coherent presence. He looked at Holmes. "This is not the intended behavior," he said sharply. Holmes replied evenly, "Intended behavior requires stable observation." A pause. "And you remove stability when you introduced recursive evaluation." The architect's expression tightened. "That is not." Holmes cut him off. "It is." A silence followed. Then Holmes added quietly, "You built a system that observes itself being observed." A pause. "And you assumed it would converge." The chamber lights flickered violently now. The floor vibrated with increasing irregularity. And the Mallory, no longer one man in any meaningful sense, stood at the center of conflicting possibilities. In one instance he turned toward the exit. In another he collapsed to his knees. In another he walked toward Holmes. All at once, Holmes raised a hand slightly. "Watson," he said quietly, "do not focus on the person." I swallowed. "Then what should I focus on?" "The selection process," Holmes replied. A pause. "The system is choosing what to preserve." The architect took a step forward. "We can still correct it." Holmes shook his head. "No. You cannot correct a system that is evaluating correction itself." The architect's voice sharpened. "Then what do you propose?" Holmes looked at him directly. "I propose you stop observing." A silence fell. Even the overlapping Mallorys seemed to hesitate. The architect frowned. "That would collapse the system entirely." Holmes nodded. A pause. "And that is the point." The chamber vibrated sharply. A deep, resonant shift passed through the structure, as though something beneath it had finally disengaged. And then, not empty, but final, the lights stabilized. The overlapping visuals ceased. The chamber resolved itself into a single configuration, and Mallory was gone. Not replaced, not relocated, not duplicated, simply absent. Holmes exhaled slowly. The architect stood frozen. For the first time he looked uncertain not about the system, but about his own position within it. Holmes stepped forward. "It has collapsed," he said quietly. The architect replied, "That is not possible." Holmes looked at him. "And yet it has occurred." A pause. The man's voice lowered. "You disrupted the evaluation cycle." Holmes shook his head. "I allowed it to complete." The architect's eyes narrowed. "That is not what we intended." Holmes replied calmly, "Intention is irrelevant once observation becomes recursive." A long silence followed. Then the architect spoke quietly. "What remains?" Holmes turned slightly toward the empty chamber. "Truth," he said simply. The architect frowned. "That is not measurable." Holmes nodded once. "No, it is not." A pause. "And that is why your system failed." The chamber was now still. Completely. Even the faint mechanical resonance had ceased. Holmes turned toward me. "Watson," he said quietly. "Yes?" "We are leaving." I hesitated. "And the man?" Holmes looked once more at the empty space where Mallory had been. Then he said softly, "There was never one man to begin with." A pause. "Only competing versions of what a man could be." He turned toward the passage. "And now the system that sustained them has ended." The architect stood silently in the center of the chamber, no longer speaking, no longer asserting control, only observing what remained after observation itself had collapsed. As we walked back through the passage, I felt something I can only describe as a strange mental quietness settling over me. Not peace, not understanding, but the absence of enforced contradiction. When we finally emerged into the daylight of Harwich, the fog had lifted slightly. The sea air felt unchanged. The town continued its ordinary movements. And yet I could not escape the feeling that something fundamental had been altered, not in the world, but in the way the world could be structured. Holmes stood for a moment outside the building, looking out toward the harbor. Then he spoke quietly. "It was never about a dead man." I looked at him. "Then what was it about?" Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "It was about whether identity survives observation." A pause. "And now we know the answer." I frowned. "Which is?" Holmes turned slightly toward me. "That it does not survive unchallenged." A silence followed. Then he added, "But it can survive interpretation, And with that, Sherlock Holmes turned away from Harwich, leaving behind a system that had attempted to replace truth with structure, and failed. We returned to London that evening in a silence I had rarely known Holmes to permit. He was not withdrawn in the ordinary sense. Rather, his attention seemed distributed across something larger than the carriage, larger even than the journey itself. At intervals he would look out through the window at the passing countryside, as though testing whether it still behaved according to expectation. I, for my part, found my thoughts returning again and again to Harwich, the overlapping identities, the collapsing Mallory, and the unnerving suggestion that observation itself had been shaping what we believed to be real. When at last we reached Baker Street, Holmes did not immediately enter. He stood upon the pavement for a moment motionless. Then he said quietly, "Something is missing." I frowned. "Missing?" He stepped inside without further explanation. The sitting-room was unchanged. Mrs. Hudson had left the lamp burning low, and the familiar clutter of Holmes's world papers, chemical apparatus, and the violin case rested exactly where they should. And yet Holmes's expression remained unsettled. He moved directly to his desk and began sorting through the correspondence that had accumulated during our absence. I watched him for a time before speaking. "What exactly are you looking for?" Holmes did not look up. A record that should not exist. I hesitated. From Harwich? From before Harwich? That answer disturbed me more than I cared to admit. He worked quickly now, opening envelopes, scanning pages, discarding them without hesitation. His movements were precise but increasingly urgent. At last he paused. Then very slowly he said, "Interesting." I stepped closer. "What is it?" Holmes held up a single sheet of paper. It was an official report. But as I glanced at it, I felt a strange, dissonant something about it refused to settle properly in my mind. Holmes spoke quietly. "This was delivered to Scotland Yard 2 days before Mallory ever arrived at Baker Street." I frowned. "That is impossible. We only received the first account yesterday." Holmes nodded. He placed the document on the table. "And yet this report describes the same event." I looked at it again more carefully. The language was formal, naval in tone, describing the disappearance of a subject under controlled observation, and referencing identity instability during containment procedures. I felt a chill pass through me. "This reads like—" I hesitated. Holmes finished the thought. "Like the conclusions of the system at Harwich." A silence followed. I looked up sharply. "But how could this be written before we arrived?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked slowly to the window. Then he said, "Watson, what if Harwich was not the origin of the experiment?" I frowned. We already concluded it was part of a larger structure. Holmes turned slightly. "Yes." A pause. "But what if that structure does not exist in a single place?" The implication settled heavily in the room. I stepped closer to the desk. "You are suggesting it exists elsewhere as well?" Holmes nodded. "Or rather," he said quietly, "elsewhere as well?" Holmes nodded. "Or rather," he said quietly, "it produces its own documentation retroactively." I stared at him. "That is not possible." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Not within conventional causality." A pause. "And yet here we are." He tapped the report gently. "This document describes outcomes before inputs." I felt my thoughts tightening. "That violates logic." Holmes replied calmly, "It violates linear logic." A silence followed. Then he added, "But not structural logic." I looked at him carefully. Holmes turned back toward the room. "The system we encountered at Harwich did not operate in sequence. It operated in layers of observation." A pause. "And if those layers are sufficiently interconnected, then result states can be generated independently of their initiating events." I shook my head slowly. "That sounds like—" Holmes corrected me. "No." A pause. "Reconstruction." The word unsettled me. Holmes continued. "They are not predicting what happens." A pause. "They are producing records of what must have happened for the system to remain consistent." I felt a tightening in my chest. "But we were there," I said. Holmes looked at me. A pause. "And yet this document suggests we arrived after the conclusion." Silence followed. The implication was difficult to articulate. Holmes returned to the desk and opened another drawer. Inside were additional papers, all similar, all official, all describing variations of the same incident, but none matching our timeline. I felt a cold unease settle in. "Holmes, what does this mean?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he said quietly, "It means we are inside a structure that can revise its own history." A silence followed. Then a faint knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered. "There is a gentleman below," she said. "He insists it is urgent." Holmes did not turn. "Name?" She hesitated. "He did not give one." Holmes closed his eyes briefly, then said quietly, "Show him up." A moment later, footsteps approached the stairs. I noticed Holmes did not move, nor did he reach for anything. He simply waited. The door opened, and a man entered. At first glance he appeared ordinary, but something about him immediately disturbed my sense of recognition, not because I knew him, but because I felt I should know him, as though memory itself had failed to complete its task. The man looked directly at Holmes, and said calmly, "I believe you have read the report." Holmes replied quietly, "Which one?" The man smiled faintly. "All of them." A silence fell. Then Holmes said, "You are not from Harwich." The man shook his head. "No." A pause. "I am from what Harwich produced." I felt my breath tighten. Holmes studied him carefully. "And what did it produce?" The man answered simply, "Continuity." A silence followed. Then Holmes spoke quietly. "You are evidence." The man inclined his head slightly. Holmes stepped forward. "Evidence of what?" The man's expression remained calm. "That observation does not end." A pause. "It only relocates." The room grew still. Holmes studied him for a long moment, then said quietly, "Watson, we may have been mistaken about the collapse." I frowned. "How so?" Holmes's eyes darkened slightly. "It may not have ended." A pause. "It may have simply moved closer." And outside, somewhere in London's fog-drenched streets, a clock struck midnight far too early once again. There are cases in which the most dangerous moment is not the crime itself, nor even its investigation, but the instant when the investigator realizes that the evidence is no longer describing events, it is creating them. The man who entered Baker Street that night carried none of the usual markers of urgency. No hurried breath, no disordered appearance, no sign of distress that one would expect from someone bearing extraordinary news. Instead, he carried certainty, and that, I have learned, is often far more unsettling. Holmes stood opposite him, perfectly still. The room seemed to contract slightly around their exchange, as though even the walls were attentive. "You say," Holmes began quietly, "that you are from what the report produced?" The man inclined his head. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "That is not a location." "No," the man replied calmly. "It is a condition." A silence followed. I found myself watching Holmes closely. There was something unusual in his expression now, not surprise, not confusion, but a rare form of intellectual caution, as though he was approaching a conclusion that refused to stabilize. Holmes spoke again. "Explain your presence here." The man did not hesitate. "I arrived because the record required correction." Holmes stepped slightly forward. "Correction of what?" The man answered simply, "Sequence integrity." I frowned. "Sequence integrity?" Holmes raised a hand slightly, indicating I should remain silent. He then said, "You are implying that the documentation we found in Baker Street is not describing events but enforcing them." The man nodded. "Yes." A pause. Holmes studied him carefully. "And you believe that by appearing here you are correcting it?" Holmes tilted his head slightly. "Or completing it." The man smiled faintly. "They are the same thing from our perspective." A silence followed. I felt a coldness spreading through the room that had nothing to do with temperature. Holmes turned away slightly, pacing once across the carpet. Then he stopped. "Watson," he said quietly, "what do you recall of the first report from Harwich?" I hesitated. "It described a dead man returning, and then disappearing." "Yes," Holmes said. "And the second report?" "It described a system of observation and identity transfer." Holmes nodded. "And the third?" I paused. "I have not seen a third." Holmes turned back toward the man. "There are more," he said calmly. The man nodded once. Holmes continued, "And each one modifies the last." A pause. Holmes's voice lowered slightly. "Then the document we read is not fixed." "No," the man replied. "It is iterative." A silence followed. Holmes stepped closer. "And what determines each iteration?" The man looked at him directly. "Your interpretation." I felt a tightening in my chest. Holmes did not move for several seconds. Then he said quietly, "So the system does not record reality." A pause. "It responds to it." The man nodded. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "And in doing so it reconstructs causality backward from observation." Holmes turned slightly toward me. "Watson, do you see the implication?" I hesitated. "That reality is being rewritten based on what we understand it to be." Holmes nodded once. Or, he corrected softly, what they allow us to understand it to be. A silence followed. The man spoke again. You are closer now than previous observers. Holmes looked at him sharply. Previous observers? Holmes's tone hardened slightly. How many? The man paused. That depends on definition. Holmes stepped forward. Answer directly. The man complied. 17 confirmed cycles. A silence fell. Even Holmes did not speak immediately. Then he said quietly, and in each cycle I arrive here. Holmes nodded slowly. And what happens after I arrive? The man studied him for a moment. Correction occurs, a pause, and then the cycle resets. I felt a chill pass through me. Holmes turned away slightly. So Harwich was not an origin point. No, it was a convergence point. Holmes exhaled slowly. And Baker Street is the next one. The man did not deny it. A silence followed. Then Holmes said quietly, Watson, this explains the reports. I frowned. How? Holmes turned back toward me. They are not written before events. A pause. They are written after outcomes have been selected. The man added calmly, and then inserted into continuity. Holmes nodded once. So when we read them, we are not learning what happened. A pause. We are being guided toward what must be believed to have happened. The room felt suddenly smaller. He moved toward the desk and picked up one of the reports again. Then stopped. For the first time I saw uncertainty cross Holmes's face, not fear, not confusion, but something rarer. Recognition of recursive structure without a visible exit. He placed the paper down carefully, then said quietly, Watson, if interpretation generates reality here. He paused. Then our presence is no longer passive. The man watched him closely. Holmes continued. It is contributory. A silence followed. Then Holmes turned slightly toward the man. And what role do you serve in this? The man replied simply, I am the stabilizer. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Of what? The man answered. Of whichever version of you is selected. A long silence followed. Outside London remained unaware. Inside Baker Street, however, something fundamental had shifted. Not the facts of the case, but the authority of facts themselves. Holmes stood still for a long moment. Then he said quietly, Watson, I believe we are no longer investigating this system. A pause. We are part of it. And at that exact moment the gas lamp in the corner flickered. And held, as though something somewhere had just confirmed the next iteration. There are moments in life when certainty does not merely weaken at reverses, as though the ground upon which one has stood for years quietly decides to become something else entirely. It was in such a state of suspended understanding that I found myself watching Sherlock Holmes that night in Baker Street. The man who called himself a stabilizer remained standing near the hearth, calm as ever, as though the implications of his own words belonged to some distant intellectual exercise rather than the very room we occupied. Holmes, however, had changed, not in appearance, not in movement, but in attention. Something in his focus had shifted inward, as though he were no longer examining the situation in front of him, but the structure that made perception itself possible. At last he spoke. You said I am selected. The man nodded. Yes. Holmes continued quietly. From a cycle of 17 iterations. A pause. And each iteration ends with correction. Yes. Holmes studied him for a long moment, then said softly, Then the system does not merely observe me. The man replied, It evaluates you. Holmes nodded once. And redefines me based on outcome. A silence followed. I watched Holmes carefully now, for I had seen him confronted before, even challenged by intelligence equal or superior to ordinary minds, but never had I saw him confronted by a system that appeared to treat him not as an individual, but as a variable within a repeating structure. Holmes turned away slowly. He walked to the window. Outside, London lay in fog, gas lamps glowing like suspended thoughts in a sea of grey. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. Watson, do you recall what the first report said about the dead man? I nodded. That he was already dead. Yes, Holmes said. And the second? That he was a subject under observation. Holmes nodded again. And the third? I hesitated. That identity was being distributed across multiple instances. Holmes turned slightly toward me. And now the fourth? I frowned. There is no fourth report. Holmes's gaze sharpened. That is incorrect. A pause. There is always a fourth. He returned to the desk and opened the drawer again. But this time something was different. The papers inside were no longer static. They were not simply documents, they were variations, slightly altered phrasing, reordered conclusions, different causal sequences describing the same events. I felt my stomach tighten. Holmes removed one sheet and placed it before me. "Read it," he said quietly. I obeyed. At first glance it resembled the earlier reports, but as I read further, I felt a disturbing sensation of displacement. It described Holmes arriving at Baker Street after the stabilizer's appearance. It described the conversation we had not yet completed. It described outcomes that had not yet occurred. I looked up sharply. "Holmes, this is not correct." Holmes nodded slowly. "It is not current." A pause. "It is predictive." I frowned. "Then it is speculation." Holmes shook his head. "No." A silence followed. Then he said quietly, "It is a recovered state." The man at the hearth spoke calmly. "The system has begun incorporating your presence into its future reconstruction." Holmes turned sharply. "My presence?" Holmes stepped forward. "So I am no longer outside the system." The man replied, "You never were." A silence fell. Holmes stood still for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Watson, we must consider a disturbing possibility." I hesitated. "What possibility?" Holmes turned toward me slowly. "That my deductions are no longer purely observational." A pause. "But are being anticipated." The room seemed colder. I frowned. "Anticipated by whom?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead he looked again at the stabilizer. "And by extension," he said quietly, "adjusted." The man nodded. Holmes continued. "So when I solve a case," a pause, "the system already knows the solution I will reach." Holmes exhaled slowly. "And prepares a structure in which that solution is inevitable." The man corrected him gently. "Not inevitable." A pause. "Compatible." Silence followed. Holmes turned away again, pacing once across the room. Then he stopped. "Watson," he said quietly, "what does that suggest to you?" I hesitated. "That you are being—" Holmes nodded. A pause. "But not toward truth." I frowned. "Then toward what?" Holmes answered softly. "Toward predictability." A silence followed. Then the stabilizer spoke again. "You are approaching the correction threshold." Holmes turned sharply. Holmes stepped forward. The man replied calmly, "When sufficient cycles converge, the system no longer requires iteration." Cycles converge, the system no longer requires iteration. A pause. "It finalizes." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And what is finalized?" The man answered simply. A long silence fell. I felt a tightening in my chest. Holmes did not move for several seconds. Then he said quietly, "So I am not solving the system." A pause. "The system is solving me." The man nodded once. "Yes." Holmes turned toward the window again. Outside, London's fog seemed thicker now, almost deliberate. He spoke softly. "Watson, do you understand what this means?" I swallowed. "That we are inside a loop." Holmes shook his head. "No." A pause. "Worse." He turned back toward me. "A loop suggests repetition." A pause. "This suggests refinement." The stabilizer stepped forward slightly. "The next iteration begins soon." Holmes looked at him directly. "And what triggers it?" The man replied calmly, "Your conclusion." A silence fell. Holmes stood very still. Then he said quietly, "Then I must be careful what I conclude." The stabilizer shook his head slightly. "It will not matter." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" The man answered simply, "Because you always conclude correctly." A pause. "And that is what makes you usable." A silence followed. I saw it then a rare stillness in Holmes's expression. Not doubt, but recognition of constraint. He turned slightly toward me. "Watson," he said quietly, "if this is true—" I nodded. "Yes?" "Then my reasoning is not free." A pause. "It is being selected for—" The room fell silent, and outside, somewhere in the fog of London, a clock struck midnight, though no one had heard it begin. I have often recorded Holmes's deductions with admiration, sometimes with astonishment, and occasionally with a sense of awe that bordered upon unease. But never before had I witnessed him approach his reasoning with something resembling deliberate resistance. That night in Baker Street the atmosphere had changed, not in any visible manner. The room was the same, the lamp still burned steadily, and the fog outside still pressed against the windows like an unspoken thought. And yet everything felt contingent, as though the world had begun to wait for Holmes to decide what it should be. The man who called himself the stabilizer stood by the hearth, silent now, watching. Holmes, however, had ceased pacing. He stood in the center of the room, perfectly still. Then he said quietly, "Watson, Yes, I replied. I am going to perform a deduction. I frowned slightly. Is that unusual? Holmes turned toward me. This one will not follow the system. A silence followed. I did not fully understand what he meant, but I understood enough to feel the tension in his voice. The stabilizer spoke calmly. You are attempting divergence. Holmes did not look at him. I am attempting independence. A pause. The man replied, That is not supported. Holmes turned slightly, then observed carefully. He walked slowly to the desk and picked up a single sheet of paper, one of the reports. He held it for a moment without reading it. Then he said quietly, Every deduction I have made since Harridge has followed a consistent structure. He paused. That structure has been observed. He placed the paper down, and therefore modeled. The stabilizer nodded once. Holmes continued, So if I repeat that structure... A pause. The outcome will be anticipated. Holmes looked at him. Then I will not repeat it. A silence followed. I felt a faint unease. Holmes had never before spoken of abandoning method, only refining it. He stepped away from the desk. Instead, he said quietly, I will begin from an invalid premise. The stabilizer's eyes narrowed slightly. That will produce error. Holmes nodded. A pause. And error is not part of your model. The man replied calmly, Error is discarded. Holmes smiled faintly. Then let us produce something you cannot discard. A silence followed. Holmes turned toward me. Watson, he said quietly, I want you to listen carefully. He continued, I am going to make a deduction that is intentionally incorrect in its foundation. I frowned. Holmes, that is contrary to everything you teach. Yes, he said simply. That is the point. The stabilizer stepped forward slightly. This action will not produce useful divergence. Holmes replied calmly, I am not seeking usefulness. A pause. I am seeking unpredictability. The man studied him. That is not stable. Holmes nodded. Exactly. A silence fell. Then Holmes began. A man is found dead in a locked room. He paused. But he is not dead. Another pause. Because death, in this instance, is not a condition of the body. The stabilizer's expression sharpened slightly. Holmes continued. It is a designation assigned after observation. I felt a tightening in my chest. Holmes went on. Therefore, if observation is manipulated, death becomes reversible. A pause. He looked at the stabilizer directly. And if death is reversible... Another pause. Then identity is not anchored to biology. The stabilizer spoke quietly. You are reintroducing previously discarded frameworks. Holmes nodded. And corrupting them. Yes. A silence followed. Holmes continued. Therefore, a man who appears to be dead, he paused, may in fact be a projection of a prior observational state. The stabilizer's eyes narrowed. That is inconsistent. Holmes smiled faintly. I am aware. A pause. But inconsistency is not failure. He stepped forward slightly. It is freedom. For the first time I saw something flicker in the stabilizer's expression. Not confusion, but instability in response behavior. Holmes continued. And if identity is a projection, a pause, then it can exist simultaneously across multiple states without contradiction. The stabilizer spoke more sharply now. That introduces systemic conflict. Holmes nodded. And conflict is not permissible. Holmes replied quietly. Not in your system. A silence followed. The room felt different now. Not altered physically, but as though the rules of interpretation had begun to loosen. Holmes turned toward me. Watson, he said softly, what do you conclude from this? I hesitated. That identity may not be fixed. Holmes nodded. A pause. Now go further. I frowned. That it may be. Holmes shook his head slightly. Still too structured. He stepped closer. Think without the system. I paused, then slowly said that identity may only exist when someone is observing it. A silence fell. Holmes stared at me for a moment, then nodded once. The stabilizer's voice cut in sharply. That conclusion is not authorized. Holmes turned toward him. That is precisely why it is valuable. A pause. The man stepped forward. You are generating an unresolvable state. Holmes replied calmly. A silence followed. Then Holmes said quietly, Because your system depends on resolution. He stepped back. I do not. And at that moment, something changed. Not in the room, not in sound, but in structure. The stabilizer took a step backward. For the first time, uncertainty entered his posture. Holmes looked at him. "And now," he said quietly, "you cannot predict my next deduction." A pause. "Because I am no longer using deduction." I frowned sharply. "Then what are you doing?" Holmes turned toward me. "I am thinking without convergence." A silence followed. The lamp flickered once, then held, and in that moment I realized something deeply unsettling. The system had not yet reacted. For the first time since Harridge, it was waiting. There are moments in scientific inquiry when the observer believes he is studying a phenomenon only to discover, too late, that the phenomenon has begun studying him in return. That night in Baker Street I realized we had crossed that threshold. Holmes stood in the center of the room in a stillness I had never seen from him before. It was not hesitation, nor contemplation. It was something far more unsettling. A deliberate refusal to complete thought. The stabilizer, who until now had maintained an unsettling composure, no longer did so. His gaze shifted between Holmes and the space around him, as though recalculating something that refused to stabilize. Holmes spoke quietly. "You are no longer certain of prediction." The man did not answer immediately. Then, softly, "Your behavior is no longer converging." Holmes nodded once. A pause. "And now you cannot resolve me." The stabilizer's voice tightened slightly. "You are introducing non-deterministic reasoning." Holmes replied calmly. "I am removing determinism entirely." A silence followed. Outside, the fog pressed harder against the windows, though I cannot say how I knew this. It was more a sensation than a visual confirmation, as though London itself had become aware that something within Baker Street had ceased to follow its expected course. The stabilizer took a step forward. "This is not permissible." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "According to whom?" The man hesitated. Holmes answered for him. "According to the system that no longer predicts me." A pause. Holmes continued quietly. "You said I am selected." "Yes." "And that selection depends on outcome." Holmes nodded. "Then you require me to produce a predictable outcome." The stabilizer did not respond. Holmes stepped closer. "And I refuse." A silence followed. Then Holmes said something I will never forget. "If identity is only what remains after observation selects it." A pause. "Then I choose not to remain selectable." The room changed, not physically, but in the manner of its silence. It became... The stabilizer's expression tightened. "You are attempting to remove yourself from the system." Holmes replied softly. "I am removing the system from myself." A pause. "And from you." The man's voice sharpened. "That is impossible." Holmes looked at him directly. "No." A pause. "It is merely unmodeled." For the first time, the stabilizer appeared uncertain of where to place his attention. His gaze shifted toward the reports on the desk, as though seeking confirmation from documentation that no longer behaved as authority. Holmes moved to the center of the room. "Watson," he said quietly. Moved to the center of the room. "Watson," he said quietly. "Yes? Tell me what you see." I hesitated. "I see you speaking with him." Holmes nodded. "And?" I frowned, trying to articulate something that felt increasingly unstable. "And I see him reacting." Holmes shook his head slightly. "No." A pause. "You are seeing selection." I looked again, and for the first time I noticed it. The stabilizer's presence was no longer singular in my perception. There were subtle inconsistencies, micro-variations in posture, timing, even gaze direction. Not enough to suggest duplication in a physical sense, but enough to suggest something more disturbing. He was being interpreted differently across observation frames. I felt a tightening in my chest. "Holmes," I said quietly. "Yes," he replied. "What is happening?" Holmes turned toward the stabilizer. "The system is losing consensus." A pause. The man spoke sharply. "That is not a valid state." Holmes replied calmly. "It is now." A silence followed. Then, unexpectedly, the stabilizer took another step backward, and stopped. His expression changed slightly. Not fear, not confusion, but something closer to recognition. Holmes noticed immediately. "You see it now," he said quietly. The man replied slowly, "You are no longer producing a single observational outcome." Holmes nodded. A pause. "I am producing several." The stabilizer's voice lowered. "That cannot persist." Holmes stepped forward. "It already has." A silence followed. Then Holmes said something that seemed to shift the entire weight of the room. "I am no longer a solution." A pause. "I am a divergence point." The stabilizer looked at him sharply. "You are destabilizing sequence integrity." Holmes replied quietly. "No." A pause. "I am revealing that it was never stable." The room fell into a deep silence. And then something extraordinary happened. The reports on the desk began to shift, not physically moving, but changing. The text within them subtly altered, phrases rearranging themselves, conclusions reordering, causal sequences dissolving and reforming. I stepped back instinctively. Holmes watched calmly. The stabilizer whispered almost to himself, "Correction is failing." Holmes nodded once. A pause. "Because there is nothing left to correct." The man's voice lowered. "You are removing the final constraint." Holmes replied softly, "I am removing the illusion of constraint." A silence followed. Then Holmes turned toward me. "Watson," he said quietly. "Yes? I want you to remember something." I nodded. Holmes continued, "There is no single version of events here." A pause. "Only interpretations competing for continuity." I swallowed. "And which is real?" Holmes looked at me steadily. "The one that survives without being enforced." A long silence followed. The stabilizer stood motionless now, not because he was calm, but because there was no longer a single consistent action for him to perform. Then Holmes said quietly, "This system requires agreement." A pause. "I withdraw mine." And at that moment, everything stopped, not abruptly, not dramatically, but as though a thought had been completed in a mind too large for the room to contain. The stabilizer's form flickered once, and then became still, not gone, not present, simply unresolved. The reports ceased changing. The fog outside no longer felt directed. Even Baker Street itself seemed to exhale. Holmes remained standing for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "It is over." I hesitated. "The system?" Holmes nodded. "And the cycle?" A pause. "And the selection process." I looked at him carefully. "And what remains?" Holmes turned toward the window. Outside, London continued unchanged, ordinary, oblivious. Then he said softly, "What always remains?" A pause. "An observer." He turned back toward me. "And the consequences of having been observed." A silence followed, and for the first time since Harridge, Sherlock Holmes did not appear to be part of any system at all. Only a man standing in a room that could no longer decide what he was. I have often been asked in later years to recount the strangest of Sherlock Holmes's cases. I have described crimes of brutality, of cunning, of almost mathematical precision. I have spoken of men who disguised themselves as others, and of others who seemed to exist in more than one place at once. Yet none of those accounts ever troubled me in the way that case at Harridge and what followed in Baker Street continues to trouble me still. Holmes remained in London after the collapse of what he called the cycle, though I cannot say with certainty that the word collapse is even correct. It suggests an ending, a clean break, a resolution. What we experienced was neither clean nor resolved. It was. For several days after that night, Holmes did not accept new cases. He spent long hours seated by the window, watching the streets with an attention that felt different from his usual observational intensity. It was less like investigation and more like listening for something that might no longer announce itself in ordinary terms. The man who had called himself the stabilizer was never seen again. Not arrested, not dismissed, not explained, simply absent from all subsequent inquiry, as though any attempt to define his existence now returned no consistent result. As for the reports, those troubling documents that once altered themselves as we read them, they remained in Holmes's possession for some time. I saw him examine them on occasion, though never with the same urgency as before. And yet I noticed something peculiar. The contents did not seem to settle in memory. Each time I attempted to recall them, I found small variations, not enough to be certain of change, but sufficient to prevent absolute certainty. A phrase altered here, a conclusion softened there, as though recollection itself refused to commit to a single version. One evening I finally asked Holmes a question I had long avoided. "Holmes," I said, "was any of it real in the ordinary sense?" He did not turn immediately. When he did, his expression was calm but distant. "Ordinary sense," he replied, "is what remains when complexity has been simplified for survival." I considered this. "And in the fuller sense?" Holmes looked out of the window for a long moment before answering. "In the fuller sense," he said quietly, "it was real in every version in which it was observed." That answer, I confess, did not bring comfort. One detail, however, remains with me more sharply than any other. On the morning I prepared this account for record, I found something unusual among my papers. A single sheet unmarked at first glance. But when I examined it more closely, I noticed faint writing that had not been there before. It read, Observation continues even after the observer believes the case is closed. I showed it to Holmes. He read it once, then placed it carefully back upon the desk. I would not preserve that, he said quietly. Why not? I asked. Holmes looked at me for a long moment. Because, he replied, it may not yet be finished writing itself. There was no further explanation, and perhaps none is possible. For even now, as I sit and record these final words, I cannot shake the sensation that the case we called the stranger who was already dead was never truly about a man, or a system, or even a cycle of investigation. It was about something far more unsettling, the possibility that understanding itself does not conclude events, but continues them. And so I leave this record not as an ending, but as I suspect Holmes would insist it be understood, as a temporary arrangement of meaning. Whether it remains so, I cannot say, not with certainty, and perhaps that, at last, is the only truth the case ever allowed us. Dr. John H. Watson.